This podcast contains descriptions of violence against children and adult language and is not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Suffer the Little Children, the podcast giving voices back to the victims of child abuse, murder, and their families. I'm your host, Laine, and this is episode 175, The Psychology of Child Abuse, with LA Not So Confidential. For this episode, I had the privilege of talking to forensic psychologists Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott, the hosts of the LA Not So Confidential podcast. With years of expertise under their belts, the doctors had plenty of insight for us into the topic of child abuse, why it happens, and much more. For anyone not familiar with the LA Not So Confidential podcast, as I mentioned, it's hosted by two actual forensic psychologists who deep dive into different topics each week. Some of their most recent episodes have dealt with extremism in the military and law enforcement, copycat crimes, and mob mentality. I can't recommend their show highly enough.
Are you fascinated by the twisted minds that commit criminal acts? I'm Dr. Shiloh.
And I'm Dr. Scott. We're both forensic psychologists working in Southern California.
In each episode of our podcast, LA Not So Confidential, we dissect the nexus where true crime, forensic psychology, and entertainment meet.
All delivered with our signature gallows humor while examining the actual diagnosis and dishing on the media portrayal of the events.
Subscribe to LA Not So Confidential anywhere you go for podcasts.
Trust us, we're doctors.
And now, please enjoy my conversation with the hosts of LA Not So Confidential, forensic psychologists Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Today, I'm speaking with the hosts of the podcast LA Not So Confidential, Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. What a great opportunity.
Do you guys mind sharing your background a little bit?
Dr. Shiloh and I had a really great opportunity. We met at the end of our academic careers in clinical psychology programs. We were at different schools, but happened to be in the same clinic for our internship. For people that don't know about the field of psychology, you do all your academics and you have a required amount of traineeship hours you have to do before you graduate. But the big one is either a full or a part-time internship where you collect 1,500 hours, and those hours are necessary for your graduation. And there's a lot of competition for sites here in Southern California. So we were at a site that was very prestigious, but didn't pay anything other than, I think we got gas money and enough for a couple of sandwiches. That was about it.
Sounds right.
Sometimes, right? But we met in this program working for pre and post incarceration sex offenders, and we hit it off immediately, and we've been friends ever since. And our families meshed very quickly. A few years ago, as I took a new position in downtown Los Angeles, Dr. Shiloh also took a position in downtown Los Angeles, and we were able to spend more physical time with each other. And yeah, she came up with the idea for the show, and it took off.
That's awesome.
But in our day jobs, we're both practicing clinical and forensic psychologists. And in those realms, Scott and I combined have done a few different things, including correctional psychology, working in prisons, as he mentioned, working with offenders who are transitioning back out into the community, including the high-risk sex offender population, as well as jail facilities, and then police psychology, like working in tandem with law enforcement, which is what we both do now. Scott partners up with them, and I am there to essentially be support services, clinical services for them. So among both at one time or another have had private practices and kind of working with just a regular population so we can keep our foot in that realm as well. But hence the reason we decided to start a forensic psychology topic podcast.
So you have some experience with the sexual offenders going back into the community and things like that. That must be difficult to handle.
You know, it was something that I think Scott and I definitely came to it from different paths, but I previously worked in law enforcement. So I was a police officer for a local agency in Los Angeles County for about 7 years and went back to graduate school during that time. And my plan was just to stay in law enforcement. I was actually planning on applying to a federal agency and staying there, but I wanted to obtain my doctorate in order to just, fluff up my resume as much as possible. And in that, I chose to do it in forensic psychology, but in these internships, I really wanted to work with the criminal population as much as possible, which isn't by definition just what forensic psychologists do. It's any crossover with the legal system. But because I was still looking at staying in law enforcement, perhaps having a specialty in sexual offenses and, helping build investigations in those types of crimes, for me, it was a no-brainer. Give me all the sites where I can just sort of be a fly on the wall, learn from them as they're going through their treatment. Really not even thinking that I wanted to be a psychologist. But eventually, once I got to that final internship and of course where I met Scott, things just started to change for me, where I decided that the psychology route was what I wanted to do. Being a law enforcement officer certainly gave me sort of that skill of compartmentalization already. And then I took that with me into my internships and working with sex offenders. But we had really fantastic training of how to also take care of yourself, being very aware
Absolutely.
of the secondary and vicarious trauma and what you're going to hear and see every single day.
Yeah, that's actually a question that I had. I wondered if you had any experience in investigating child abuse or murder cases of children who were abused. And I've always been very empathetic toward the first responders, the investigators, the prosecutors. It must be just horrific. And I don't know how well the compartmentalization actually works in cases like that.
Yeah, I find that I had a very fortunate experience. The city I worked for was, by Los Angeles County standards, pretty small town. And certainly I had my share of traumatic exposures, but I was a first responder that whole time. I was a patrol officer. Because I went back to grad school, it worked really well for my schedule in that I'd never moved into investigations, but I was the first person on a lot of those scenes, seeing things as they were unfolding. Fortunately, I never once dealt with the death of a child, which I don't know how I went my whole career without that. Some very scary, like accidental or medical calls with children, but fortunately none that ended in the death of children. And I don't think we had any homicides in our city while I was on duty the entire time that I was there. So, but some very close ones, where people were violently attacked within inches of their life. So it's such an interesting thing now being a police psychologist and having all of the experience and training about how to take care of our first responders that are significantly exposed to that, especially big city cops who are seeing this in high crime areas and high violent areas, that I know absolutely how fortunate I am not to carry a lot of that with me. But we need to do better at taking care of them. And I think finally, we're not just talking about it. Agencies, at least here in the US, are really trying to take better care of their officers. And for me, and I'll kind of wrap up this part of my rant, but for me, the wellness of officers leads directly to them making better decisions out there in the field, which extends to so many other things that our country's talking about right now, like police violence or overuse of violence. And if they're just in a better place and we're taking care of their trauma, they're less likely to do that.
My experience is a little different from starting off where Shiloh and I met working together with these individuals who were going in or coming out of prison. It shaped my idea and my plan for my career. I was a midlife graduate student, and I'm kind of pushing it because I was 40 when I started. It wasn't like midlife, really. It was a little bit older. But what I did in going through that process, I purposely chose to go work in the prison system for a number of reasons. One is because I knew from personal experience that what can be done for individuals in the prison system when they have mental health care, it can be transformative and it can change the community. It can change a person's life, and you can have a huge impact on people. And it's also like a guaranteed job because not everybody is cut out for it. So I thought, well, let's see if I can handle this. And I went and worked in the prison system. It was a really great experience. It was quite difficult. But what I really figured out in working with that is that as clinicians, whether you're a psychologist, a social worker, an MFT, or an LPCC, is that you really need to understand where your strengths are and what your limitations are. So if you have limitations, where can you lean into that edge of growth that you really need to lean into? And what I found out was I had a real weak spot, and my weak spot was working with kids. And there's a number of reasons for that, but the main two were that a lot of my own personal stuff got triggered. And I'm like a therapy baby. Like I've been in therapy for decades, and it has made me able to have a much higher quality life. But a lot of my stuff in working with kids came up, and not like I was abused or neglected, but I realized that my stuff got triggered. The second part was the level of anger I had towards the perpetrators of crimes and abuse against children was way off the chart. And I really needed to get a handle on that in order to be able to be a good clinician in working with kids. But, as a clinician, you have the ability to forge your path, and you can move in any direction you want to, given your abilities or your willingness to learn and adapt. And I ended up working in a co-responder model where I am to this day. I work with detectives in a large law enforcement agency, and we do go out. We investigate charges of bullying. We investigate follow-up, making sure that Department of Child and Family Services is involved if there's an allegation. So as much as I try to avoid working with that population, I've ended up having to face it. It's like, I chose not to face my demons. So the universe, or however you want to frame it, kind of said, no, you're going to work on this. And I'm a better clinician because of it. I still don't prefer it. Like in my private practice, I would never choose. And I would also refer out to people that are absolute experts in child psychology or intense, high acuity family conflict. That's not what I would do in my private practice, but it is what I do in my day job.
So you do investigate cases where there are kids involved. How are you now as far as the triggering and all of that? Is it a little bit easier once you start getting into it?
That's a great question. And I'm really surprised that I'm better at it than I used to be. But the reason I'm better at it is that I had to go, whoa, I have to make a concerted effort to pull way back and see the big picture. Because if I go into a household and I'm only interviewing 2 family members, but 3 are absent, I'm really only getting a fraction of the story. So I came in as a solid, experienced clinician at the master's level and the doctorate level before I started this job. But the experience I got in working with detectives has been phenomenal about how to really crank open your perspective on issues. And I'm also lucky in that, because I work for a very large mental health system in conjunction with law enforcement, if someone has been in our system, I can see literally years of records of their treatment, and I can see if DCFS has been involved. We can confer like, well, does this family member who is allegedly perpetrating, what's their criminal history like? So we go in with a lot of information, but we don't go in to be punitive. Our goal is to keep these incidents from happening again and link people to the appropriate level of care. And sometimes linking people to appropriate care means I'm going to court and I'm on the stand advocating, and I'm doing air quotes when I say advocating. I'm advocating for mental health treatment for parents that may have a tendency to not be able to regulate their emotions in a healthy way within a family system.
Yeah, I think mental health has a lot to do with many of the cases I've talked about. There's definitely a link. And that was another question that I wanted to ask both of you is there any kind of specific reason or multiple reasons that someone becomes a child abuser or that someone can't regulate their temper?
I think Scott would be probably better to speak about child abuse in general if we're talking about physical abuse. And I can maybe speak to the sex offender part or sexual abuse part a little bit more.
That's a really great question. And I guess my first answer would be it all depends. Because if we're looking at the precipitating event or the event of violence or the nadir point of violence against an individual, whether that individual is an adult or a child, there are so many roads that can be taken to reach that point. And it might be a path of mental illness. It might be a path of hardcore substance use, bad life choices. And it could also be something horrific like intergenerational transmission of trauma, where a person had a horrible experience of child abuse themselves, and that's their baseline. Like they think that that's okay to continue perpetrating down the road. I do think that we really have to take into consideration a huge number of cultural considerations, which is about, certainly the predominance is going to be male perpetrators of violence against children within the family system. At least that's what we see. Statistically, it's higher than women. But I'm not minimizing what can happen when female partners or women, mothers, perpetrate on their children. But what we do see is that we live in still a patriarchal structure within the Western world that really sort of makes a lot of excuses for men to act a certain way. And, there's a lot of interesting conversations. If anybody's on Reddit, there's a great subreddit called Boomers Being Boomers. And
oh, yes.
While it's non-statistically validated, there's a lot of credence behind an older generation's standard response to things being, well, I went through shit and I turned out fine. So you should be able to go through shit and turn out fine. And Why are you being so spoiled? And on and on and on and on and on. There's a real fallacy there. The fallacy there is about compassion and empathy and insight into your own trauma, which should, in a really healthy adult, should result in someone going, I went through absolute horror and I will not perpetrate that on my children. I will not allow that to happen. I will have insight. I will go get help. But, that's asking a lot of people. It's not asking more than should be asked, but for some people that are set in their ways, especially in a patriarchal system, is, the man is the king of his castle. And why wouldn't everyone in that home act exactly the way that he demands that they act? And you can see it certainly in American culture, but there's also other cultural spheres of influence where, in families where there's really an emphasis on machismo, or when there's really an emphasis on that hard line between parents. In some cultures, there's a very clean break. And it's not that there shouldn't be a clean break. There's an understanding, you're not your child's friend. You can be your child's friend eventually, but you have to be really clear about boundaries and family dynamics and family systems. But there are some cultures that absolutely say the parent gets to act any way they want because they are the parent. So that's my long-winded way of saying is that we have to look at the really big picture before we start drilling down into what the triggers are. And I always defer to this social worker out of Canada, Kevin Cameron, who's just a brilliant, brilliant writer and theorist and threat assessment, risk management expert. And he has this phrase, he says that no one ever snaps and that the pathway to violence is an evolutionary process. So it's very, very rare that perpetrators of violence, especially against children, just pop off. There's always a road. There's a foundation that's been laid toward those acts.
You always see a pattern of violence leading up to it and things like that. I like that nobody ever snaps.
Although there's, television shows called that.
I'll pause here for a quick word from my sponsors.
So just very succinctly, when it comes to sexual abuse perpetrated against children, in the over a decade that I worked with these offenders, what we would do is when they came in, we would do an assessment and then we focus their treatment accordingly. And, our whole purpose and mission is that, unfortunately, we're getting them on the back end of it, but it's to ensure as much as possible that another victim is never created. So when we want to assess them, and again, of course, there's a lot of offenders that offend against adults, but just focusing on those that offend against those, let's say, under the age of 18 for purposes of labeling that, right off the bat, and I'm really oversimplifying this, but we want to look and determine, is this an ingrained sexual attraction, or was this the other category we see of more of an opportunistic situational incident or incidents in which they acted out sexually against a child? So with the sexual attractions that would fall into the categories of a paraphilia, meaning that it's abnormal in terms of their sexual attraction, and it has crossed over, obviously, if they're coming to see me in terms of something criminal, that is, where you have your pedophilia, which would be the attraction to prepubescent children. And then there's kind of a category of hebephilia, which is post-pubescent teens. And bear with me. I mean, your audience, I'm sure, has heard a lot of different things. So I'm not editing myself too much here because I know they've listened to a lot. But with hebephilia, we look at that when adolescents, post-pubescent teens are the primary sexual interest of that person or that perpetrator. Although and we have done this in research studies, if we look at who heterosexual men are attracted to, it does include post-pubescent teen girls because they have secondary sex characteristics, and it's very evolutionary in terms of their attraction and psychology behind that. But if this is primary above and beyond, say, adult women, then we could technically label it as a paraphilia. And then, of course, if they act out on that, which, state by state, certainly the age of consent is different, then it would be criminal. So you have that category, which I'm going to kind of push to the side because that's easy to say, like, that is their particular sexual attraction, and therefore that's why they abuse. Although I will put a caveat on there. There are some people that do have paraphilias that never act out on them. So the other category, looking at opportunistic and situational, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what Scott was saying in that we have to look at not just the psychology of that person, but maybe even more so give weight to the stressors that are going on in their life at the time. And that's part of our assessment, is looking at the different elements and risk factors that we have determined that make someone more likely to reoffend, what was going on at their life during that time. And this may very well be an action that they took because they had no other coping mechanisms. I know that sounds like I'm minimizing the heck out of this, but to give a very brief example, there's been situations in which there's a mother, there's a father in the home, and then there's a child. The mother, for whatever reason, kind of becomes absent. Sometimes it's maybe she passes away. Maybe she has a severe illness. Maybe she has her own mental health struggles and has disengaged from the family. So now you have a very stressful environment for everyone. On top of that, with, let's say, our hypothetical male perpetrator, he is now under more stress being the single parent. He is the sole breadwinner. He has to keep the household up. And sometimes, let's say the daughter in this hypothetical case sort of steps up into her mother's role. Then you can start to see how stress starts to get blurred with some of those boundaries. And so there might be some sexual abuse perpetrated. That's one example out of a gajillion examples. I've seen so many different scenarios, which goes back to Scott's original answer of it just depends. It's really a case by case. We can do the best to say, here are similarities we see. And that's helpful for, obviously, the psychologist's work on the back end to say, okay, what do I need to target to ensure this doesn't happen again?
Doing it on a case-by-case basis would have to be the only way you could do it because there's no one answer to that question. So I also wanted to ask, and I don't know if you guys have any input on this, but a question that I get asked all the time is, why is it so often mom's boyfriend?
So for sexual offenses or child abuse in general?
In general, yeah. And I mean, there are definitely cases where there's sexual abuse as well, but in the ones that I've seen, there's almost always physical abuse on top of it.
I want to throw out a theory, which I wish they would, in this particular element that you're referring to, I wish they would put some more research toward this, because it is in the primate world. This is not uncommon that a male comes into a new environment and, there's a biological imperative to continue their own genetic material, right? So what do is you take it out on the kids. I mean, and in some animal communities, not all, there would be a culling of like, let's take out all the male children so that they won't carry on that other competitor's strain. Now, I can't obviously make a complete bridge over to humans, but if we talk about it from an emotional stance, is what do those kids represent to that individual that's coming in to this new dynamic? And then going back to my point before of when males perpetrate on these kids, it's power, right? Or it's about a feeling of deficit of power within themselves, and they're expressing it on the easiest targets. And that's my main theory. Shiloh, what do you contribute?
Well, I think there's a couple things. Again, I always hesitate to go off of anecdotal or stories that I hear or what is put out into the media. So I too would like to see research on, do the numbers really show that it is the majority mom's boyfriend? Because maybe those are the stories that are just getting the media attention, right? We have to see how the information we're consuming gets to us in the first place. So I think that's number one. I think the second thing, and especially with sexual abusers, is that sexual perpetrators tend to put themselves in situations where they will have access to victims. So if these perpetrators are inclined to sexually offend, they're going to find girlfriends who have children that they can offend against. I don't know about physical child abuse in general, so I'm not speaking to it in that way. I'm just kind of staying in this lane of sexual abuse. So it's kind of like the question of well, why are so many scoutmasters sexual offenders, right? If we look at the numbers, obviously it's going to not be that way, but those perpetrators find those occupations that give them access to children so they can perpetrate upon them. So not dissimilar to how they might seek out relationships and the victims that they could have access to.
And again, just to highlight my point as well, is if someone comes into a relationship and they're not emotionally mature, if they're not emotionally evolved, a man comes in and has this new person in their life. If they're not emotionally involved, they're going to see the children as competition. And there is some research for that as well. Again, like Shiloh was saying, we would love to see some solid journal research, which is where we like to go instead of just going to, sort of bloody news headlines, as it were.
Yeah, there should be a lot more research on a lot of topics surrounding this larger topic, but it is pretty sparse.
Yeah, I think it's the way we collect data too, especially, just looking at homicides in general. And then if you're looking at children who are victims of homicides, you can gather data from that. But we don't really know what goes on inside of a house when it comes to abuse for a very, very long time. So I always say on the show, we don't know what we don't know because we don't have that data. We can't collect it. There's just probably, unfortunately, so much more going on behind the scenes until there's some sort of intervention or attention to law enforcement or mental health. So, there's unfortunately, too many cases out there where we could get the information. It's behind closed doors for such a long time.
Yeah, exactly. You do hear a lot about it, but it's usually after the fact. And if there is any intervention ahead of time, I've seen so many cases where CPS has refused to take the child or put the child back into a home where they probably shouldn't have been and things like that. Have you had any experience with DCFS or any other agency pushing back? And I know, Dr. Scott, you had said you are involved with them a little bit when it comes to the investigations.
So I have to say that overwhelmingly my experience here in Southern California with DCFS agencies has been really positive. And I'm going to give an example in a little bit of something that went really, really badly wrong. But I will be the first one to stand up for clinicians that really want to do the right thing. And to be honest, I don't even know how they do their jobs. I may come in and afterwards, after everything's been swept up, and okay, let me pull this apart. We can make a referral here. Let's do this. Maybe this should happen. Let me go testify in court. But the ones that are really the foot soldiers on the ground are psychologists, social workers, and MFTs that are out there in the homes having to make these really tough decisions about removing kids from their homes. And one of the things that we do talk about that's very frustrating for us is that we can talk about having to separate your emotions out of the process of doing really hardcore clinical work in the community. But one of the most difficult things is to separate, like, okay, I can be a hard ass, I can be detached, I can be healthfully detached from this situation so that I make a good clinical decision. But it's hard not to get pulled into those things. And your heart or your emotional response regulation system in your brain really wants you to yank that kid out of a dangerous situation. And you want to keep them out of that situation. And I think that our normal response, it's normal. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct or right, but our normal response is this child should not go back to this environment. When studies showed that overwhelmingly, even in cases of abuse, is that children prosper better in their biological home. And I know that's going to get a lot of reaction from people, and I have a reaction to it as well. I don't like it because I want to make things perfect for this kid that is having so many problems. But the answer is not as clean or as easy as we would like it to be. It's one of the things where we would make assumptions years ago. Well, the best thing is to go into a foster home or to go into an orphanage. This kid would be much better off if they were just completely removed from that family environment. And they're not always. I mean, there are wonderful foster families out there. There are also terrible foster families out there. And the orphanage system was awful as well. I mean, kids were abused and taken advantage of in that system. So I wanted to picture, like, that's how difficult it is making those decisions, so that we can have very emotional responses about what our gut wants to tell us is the right thing to do. And that in itself doesn't make room for the fact that some of these parents are immature and need to be offered the opportunity to grow themselves. Does that make sense? I mean, I know it sounds like a little bit complex because you want to go, wait, you abused your kid. But we also have to hold very difficultly, and I know a lot of your listeners are going to have a reaction to this, so I understand, and I'm down here in the mud with you, is that we have to, in our protection and support of healing for our most vulnerable individuals in our population, we have to hold that same grace and possibility for the perpetrators of that violence. Now, Shiloh's population that she worked with for another decade after I left the internship working with sex offenders, that's a completely different thing. I'm talking about physical abuse, neglect, emotional abuse. There usually is wiggle room for the perpetrator to grow, to heal, to become responsible and have consequences for their actions, versus individuals that are predisposed towards sex crimes against children. Would you agree, Shiloh?
Yeah, I definitely would. I am someone that, also kind of circling back to this concept of working in and around children, that I get asked the question a lot, how could you work with that population? And I don't know why, but my answer is, I'm just built for it. I'm able to work with this population, not be a mess myself, because I think if I worked with victims, I would be, and especially now as a parent. But there's something about the way I work, which I can walk into that room, work with someone who's done something horrible with the goal of this work that we're doing right now is meaningful because we are reducing the risk of creating another victim. And seeing that person as a person and as a multitude of different factors that led to them perpetrating this crime, and then untangling that and getting them to understand it and how they can do things differently if they feel a certain way. So I would take it a step further and say, as a clinician working with offenders, even some of the worst, that grace has to be there to walk in and do the work with them to give it the best chance possible that someone else isn't victimized in the future. So yeah, a lot of these folks, whether it's acting out violently or acting out sexually, it's because they don't know another alternative. So why not have a clinician working with them while also ensuring, above and beyond anything else, that the children are safe, right? So if that means they do have to be separated, absolutely. And some people should never be around children again, but they should have the opportunity to be able to become better versions of themselves, because we don't lock up those people forever and throw away the key. So we have to have a system that works well.
Time for another word from my sponsors. I love hearing that, actually. I preach empathy and people talk about black and white thinking. That comes up a lot because it's either you're good or you're bad, but that's just not reality.
Right.
We have to look at them all as people. Another question regarding empathy that I just wanted to roll in a little bit is, and it probably has to do with black and white thinking as well, but sometimes the general public, when you hear about a terrible case, they show an extreme lack of empathy toward surviving family members as well, even though they were not the perpetrators. And I'm wondering why you think that might be, why they might be so willing to blame someone who didn't actually cause a child's death.
Well, without going too far into my story, I have actually experienced that, and it wasn't in regard to a child victim. But again, it does speak to black and white thinking and what is easier. It's easier to just have a very narrow view of a situation rather than taking a big picture and sitting, like I use this term because I had a supervisor use it all the time, is down here in the mud. Like we have to be down here in the mud and the discomfort in order to really have a conversation about understanding. And I have, I've witnessed it myself, but I've also seen it in the public where you see someone that commits a horrific crime. And because the execution of that crime is so alien to our own nature, or we like to think that it's alien to our nature, because the same people that are so horrified by the execution of a crime against a victim are also the same ones that have the same dark, intrusive thoughts that all of us have. There's not a person on this planet that hasn't at some point had really, really dark thoughts. That's just being human. You can't escape that. But I know that in the pursuit of understanding for why a crime was perpetrated, actually, is people want to go, well, this person couldn't have just emerged whole cloth as this terrible person. There has to be somebody that's responsible for it. And guess who gets the blame the majority of the time? Mom.
The mothers. We always blame the mothers.
Over and over again. Is like, well, what did mom do? What did mom do? Or what didn't she do? Exactly. And another example that I use, and like this ties back to that difficult discussion about grace, is that as people who care about children, as people who care about humanity, we can have so much empathy and care and concern and rage about a child that is exposed to violence on a daily basis, exposed to domestic violence, has violence perpetrated upon them by the biological parents and the step parents, and then also clings to one potential positive relationship, and that positive relationship is also toxic and exposes them to inappropriate levels of sexuality or sexual expression and criminality. Like, isn't that a horrible thing? Like, you just have so much empathy for that child. How could anybody do that to that child? But what we don't do is 10 years later, when that child becomes Richard Ramirez and creates an absolute arc of fear and terror across an entire region, we don't have so much empathy for him anymore, right?
Right. Exactly.
I think, it's also just in how people lack so much empathy, again, comes back to how we consume this material. And if, kind of differentiating maybe the true crime consumer from other folks who are just seeing, again, like news story after news story, and it's always the bad stuff. If it bleeds, it leads, that to just write it off quickly. And we tend to compare other people's situations to ours. It's just a human thing that we do. So as Dr. Scott was saying, there's this lack of being able to wrap your head around that because you just don't understand it. And lack of understanding then leads to lack of empathy a lot of times. So it's like, oh gosh, what was going on in that family, right? What a piece of work the mom was for letting that happen. She must have known, right? That's been the old adage forever, because I would know in my household and that wouldn't go on under my nose.
Right.
So there's like this comparison to ourselves and our families, which culturally, socioeconomically can be so different. But that's what I love about how the true crime community has evolved, is that they do want more explanation. They do want to understand. And I think, maybe if they're not even like, oh, I want to have more empathy for this person, I want to be able to understand it. And maybe it leads to maybe just that, like, oh, okay, I kind of see how that happened. And now I don't paint everybody with the same brush and just write them off or put them in a jar up on a shelf labeled evil. And that's that. Because again, that's black and white thinking. That's way too easy to do.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's how I kind of started out. I started this project as a blog 5 years ago, and I was a lot more harsh when it came to the perpetrators and less examination of why they did what they did. And of course, there's no excuse for it per se, but definitely is worth looking into how something like this can happen.
Right. Because if we really want it to stop, then we need to understand how people get to the position that they do, where they act out in that way, or how one of the elements of my job uses a model called PATH, which is providing alternatives to hinder extremism, is how it comes out. And what we do is we want to see, like, in the development of these behaviors, where can we intervene along the way? And like you're saying, if we don't look at how this got to be where it, if it ended in a horrific case of abuse, or if it ended in a case of murder, we have to look at it. We have to move backwards through that path line and see what could have been done where. Maybe we can't change what happened in this case, but if we have a better understanding, then we can provide services. One of the things that's kind of amazing about Southern California, and I know you have listeners all over the country, and there's a lot of, like, everybody thinks California is a thing, but unless you live here, you don't really understand. But we have an incredible mental health system across LA County that is, the services that it offers, wraparound services through Department of Child and Family Services, and all these different levels of care that go from just case management to outpatient clinics to higher levels of care that are 2 or 3 times a week with family support services. And all of those things are built on the understanding that the earlier you intervene, the more likely you are to be successful in preventing these type of events.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I wanted to know, it kind of wraps around if there is any intervention that can be done. When it comes to personality disorders per se, that often seems to be involved. And I'm not sure if you would consider that under the mental illness umbrella or something separate. I wanted to ask you about that. But if there's something that can be done for people like that, or is it just something you never know and it's kind of like rolling the dice?
Great question. Well, and this is ever evolving, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I would say is that there's no easy answer, because we can't lump all personality disorders in together, even though, unfortunately, diagnostically in the last few years, our DSM is trying to do just that, is that personality disorders are this spectrum, and it's really not, because the latest research over the past, I think, 6 or 7 years has indicated that many of the assumptions we had about personality disorders was only partially correct. And the expression of the more severe personality disorders, while there is a biological basis, there is a wiring issue in individuals with antisocial personality disorder or borderline or histrionic, all those what we used to call cluster B. The majority of those will not be triggered unless there are adverse childhood experiences. So again, it's not a simple black and white, we can lump all these individuals into one category. I would say, though, because your question is so interesting, I would say that it might be easier for individuals with personality disorders that at least understand human emotions to be a little bit more feeling or compassionate, or at least can find some kind of alignment with their children. The ones that are going to have a harder time with it are individuals who are narcissistic, because no one else in the world really exists except the narcissist, right? Everyone around them is an extension of them. And with antisocial is that there's a lot of indication that someone with antisocial personality disorder probably has a neurological difference in their makeup that really makes it almost impossible for them to understand or mirror the emotional state of the people around them.
And God forbid those two are present at the same time.
Bad combo.
You're talking probably quite criminogenic, and the propensity for violence could be higher as well, and is just very, very hard to treat. And that's kind of the thing with personality disorders is if they get into treatment, I mean, certainly there are very good evidence-based treatments for a lot of personality disorders, but they have to find their way to therapy first. And a lot of times it's sort of like this catch-22 where their personality disorders might not encourage them to seek out treatment. So it's only really, again, when has to be some sort of intervention because of something legally or crossing over with the system. But it's a great question. And I think as Dr. Scott said, we're just learning more and more all the time that's new that we thought we had it pretty down pat for decades in psychology.
And like Dr. Shiloh was saying, is that people can find their way towards therapy, but even if they're in the process of therapy, what is the motivation? Like, is the motivation still going to be this external view of the world of nobody gets me, it's everybody else's problem? Because, the process of therapy and internal growth is a matter of really being able to look at yourself on an introspective level, understand that you have a part in creating the chaos that surrounds you. And that can be really difficult for individuals with the more severe ends of personality disorders.
Yeah, kind of expecting them to have self-awareness or to care how their behavior affects the people around them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, time for one last sponsor break. Now, I wanted to ask too, I'm sure you're aware of the phenomenon of having a target child or scapegoating or Cinderella effect, that sort of thing. I wonder if you have any input or any thoughts on why that happens, why it's a specific child that bears the brunt of the parents, their abuse.
Scott, what episode did we talk about that? Now she's like sparking I feel like we discussed that in the last couple of years, didn't we?
I'm not sure. I think we may have actually, it might have been on one of our episodes where we refer to the use of Disney tropes for mental health or sort of behavioral issues. And, Princess Syndrome certainly, or Cinderella Syndrome is one of them. But what you're talking about really in family systems, family therapy, is the identified patient. So there's one person that gets sort of named as the problem, right? And what we know from organizational psychology, which I am not an expert in organizational psychology, it's a really fascinating branch of psychology that has its own in-depth research and an area of study. But where we do have an overlap from organizational and industrial psychology that looks at workplace dynamics, is there's an overlap with family systems, is that any system will attempt to find homeostasis that it works pretty good at. It may not necessarily be programmed to work super well, but it can be. But we have, as humans, a tendency to do some very weird things in group settings. I mean, we really are a very strange species. one of the things that organizational psychology has found out, that you can take an absolute wonderful group of workers, all of them smart, intelligent, savvy, and passionate, and there will be a shift in dynamics where one person slacks off. There absolutely will be that. It happens almost every time. And what we found in dysfunctional families is if there's not a really great parental system that has insight into their own shit, they will allow those dynamics to emerge in their own family. And it can be for nothing. Like, we would like to think that, oh, you know, the goth chick or the kid listening to death metal music is always going to be the identified patient in the family dynamic, but it's not that easy. You know, many times parents will see one child as representing or being a mirror for what they see as their own best qualities. And so they will reinforce that by giving them positive attention. And by the same token, they will look at another child, and for some reason, they will see a reflection of all of their worst qualities, whether or not that is objectively true. They will see their worst qualities, and it gets them angry. So if you don't have any insight, if you're not willing to go to therapy or look at like what's getting triggered in you, you see that child as other, or that child is representative of the worst qualities of the family. And if you're unbridled in that way, you can allow that child to be the recipient for a lot of really, really bad behavior.
Yeah, I think that would explain why a lot of the time when there is a targeted child, there's a step parent involved, but the biological parent is also going along with it or participating in it.
Yeah, I mean, I have an example, if we have time to hit on it today, that we hear from Southern California that is very much about that.
Well, quickly, I found where we spoke about it, and we spoke about it just briefly because there is no research for anything, you know, specifically out there that is truly labeled Cinderella syndrome, but it's really covered.
As Disney fans, we think that there should be, right?
Of course. It was when we covered the Natalia Grace documentary. So that came up as something that was possibly a dynamic going on there, which there are many dynamics going on there that feed into that, and, you know, maybe including some poster children for personality disorders. But
true.
Yeah, that's when we touched on it.
A lot of times too, the targeted child is special needs in some way, and they've caused some sort of disruption in the family, and they just take it out on them. But the fact that they can get the other children involved in it is the most upsetting part.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask a little bit about that, where brain development comes into it. Youthful offenders, because there's one case that I covered where it was 4 members of the family were actually charged and arrested, including a 14-year-old who delivered the fatal blow. And a lot of people were upset that he wasn't given life in prison, but he was literally 14. How do you think that can be dealt with? Because it's the family dynamic that caused him to be that way, or maybe there's something wrong underlying that can't be fixed.
Yeah, I mean, not just that he was 14, but certainly, you know, there was the very powerful influence of the rest of the family. I mean, that's not just a 14-year-old going out and committing a murder on their own, and then us trying to understand that, and do they get tried as an adult, right? This is a dynamic from just the little bit that you mentioned right now that is very, very complicated. And I have never worked with children. I'm not a child psychologist. I'm not trained in that way. But there have been, especially in the forensic psychology world, when we look at how we treat and assess adults as compared to children, there absolutely has to be a difference. And sort of our mantra there is children are not short adults. We can't just treat them like a smaller version of an adult.
You know, there's a case, I can't go into this too far because both Dr. Shiloh and I, in our different positions, many times we will be at the same trainings. You know, at the end of this month, we're both going to be going to a Kevin Cameron training on his violence response model because our agencies are sending us. But there's also, you know, we get privy information that is not necessarily always fully disclosed to the public, so that we as professionals can understand this. But one of the ones that is more information is slowly being released to the public and I can speak a little bit to this, happened in Paris, California, where a family, a really, really disturbed dad, was moving his very large family from city to city. And this is a really, really disturbed individual. And the children, thankfully, they all survived. But I had the opportunity to hear one of the surviving male children who is absolutely prospering. He's doing really, really well right now. I got to hear him speak at one of our conferences. And, for one thing, and for all the tough work that I do, there are some things that absolutely will pull at my heart. And I just want to sob. And this kid that he survived it, he's a young man now, but he survived it. And that the majority of his siblings are doing really well, although some of them are quite challenged. But he fully admits that at one point, his mother and father, his biological parents, just didn't want to deal with having kids anymore. So they dumped 6 kids in a trailer that was 45 miles away from where the parents were living. And the dad would show up maybe once every 2 weeks with a couple of bags of groceries, like loaves of bread and jars of peanut butter and maybe some Gatorade. And these kids became Lord of the Flies, basically. And they admit to the things that they did. They had to make up rules because they were not allowed to interact with the public. So they were trying to figure out life. It was almost like a study of a primitive society, right? So I think that speaks to your point that all of those individuals involved in that particular case really need a lot of leeway, even though some of them are well into adulthood, the understanding that they never had a chance. And then what's really interesting, as I was listening to all of this and taking in other information I know about other members of that family, is what I did not know is that the father married his wife, the biological mother of all these children, who was engaged in tying them up, of, denying them food, of engaging in corporal punishment. He married her when she was under 16 years old.
Oh, great.
So did she have a chance?
It doesn't sound that way.
Again, it goes back to this, just how complex all of this is. But I agree with your point about we have to look at kids who perpetrate on other children, especially in the family dynamic, was acting out in that way the only thing that they could do to survive.
Yeah, a lot of times it seems like that is why, or that's at least what they will say is why. There's oftentimes a lot of domestic violence mixed in with the child abuse, intimate partner violence and that sort of thing. So That's a whole other can of worms to open up, is why do some moms let it happen, quote unquote. Sometimes it's not as simple as that. I just wanted to ask, the last thing I think that I wanted to bring up is there are some cases where people seem to specifically seek to foster or adopt or regain custody of their children just to abuse them, is what it looks like from the outside. But what do you think the motivations could be for trying to bring a child into your home to mistreat them?
Well, one of them that I mean, this is anecdotal, but it's anecdotal from the work that I do. I have been in the presence of parents being interviewed, and their take on it is, I am the parent. I know my child better than anyone else. I know how to discipline my child. I know what my child should be doing. And when they say should be doing, it can be an absolutely insane view of the world and the way things should be. But it's about power. It's about, I am the parent, I get to make the decisions, and you as protective services, or you as law enforcement, or you as the judge, you are not going to tell me what to do with my child. So then that to me indicates that there's a lot going on for that person that has to be, really is personality driven. Like, that's very narcissistic thinking. That individual in that moment is not able to step outside themselves and go, well, I can't get my drug addicted brother out of the house. He won't leave, and I can barely manage that. But somehow I think it's great for my toddler to come back into this environment. It is just, it's altered thinking.
Yeah, I would hypothesize that it is about that control, that power, and there isn't a ton of research on instances of familicide, but when we did cover that many moons ago, we found that especially with the males, there was a lot of this thinking of family as their possessions, family as, again, as we see with narcissists, extensions of themselves or their property to be able to do with what they want. I would certainly hypothesize that is going on, as well as just maybe we need to explore what their beliefs of abuse is. If they have this false understanding or what they choose to believe of what's abuse and what isn't, hearkening back to Dr. Scott saying, I'm going to make them do what I want them to do. And that's the end of it, no matter how I need to make that happen. Certainly some of that thinking is going on. So I think it's a little bit more complex than like, hey, let me have my kid back so I can beat him, right? It's not like a to B sort of intent there. There's just other personality and cognitive thought patterns there that need to be explored.
Again, that idea of the narcissist not really seeing that other people are other people. And especially when it comes to a child, the narcissist says, this is my child. And they might as well be talking about this is my arm, my hand and fingers should be moving the way my brain tells it to. And they think of their children in the same way. I guess as an example of a non-biological perpetrator like you had been speaking about at the beginning of the episode, and is really one of the more famous ones here in Southern California and really tragic. I mean, they're all tragic, was the death of Gabriel Fernandez in 2013. And Gabriel was an 8-year-old male child from Palmdale, California. It's a community just north of Los Angeles. And he was killed by a final beating by his biological mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isaro Aguirre. And they've both been adjudicated. Aguirre is sentenced to death. Pearl is life imprisonment without parole. And it was a very controversial case here in Southern California that really highlighted the fact that our DCFS program is incredibly overworked. I mean, again, I say I've worked with absolutely wonderful clinicians out of DCFS, but their caseloads are incredibly high, like incredibly high. And what is indicated, and I won't go into this too much, but it looks like there was a real breakdown in communication between the clinicians and their supervisors. The clinicians were charged for negligence, and thankfully those were dropped because I think it was later found that they had been reporting to their supervisors, like, this kid is in trouble, this kid is in trouble. And they were not given the latitude to take actions. But the thing that's a kicker for me, and I use this, I'm a trainer for a police agency in mental health intervention training. And in one of my lectures, I always revert back to male perpetrators of violence against children in the family system can be so heavily influenced by cultural beliefs. And in Gabriel Fernandez's case, the main drive for Isaro's violence against Gabriel was Isaro's belief that Gabriel was gay. So
right, at 8 years old.
At 8 years old. And he felt like he could beat it out of them. He regularly beat Gabriel. He was forced to eat cat litter and feces. He was burned. He was shot with a BB gun, forced to wear women's clothing. And that's just the beginning. It was really, really awful. And I mean, what research does show us is that males who have this level of anger against a perception of sexuality are fighting an internal demon where they probably are more likely to be on that end of the Kinsey spectrum as far as their own sexuality. So it was a horrible death, a horrible situation. But this was another example, I guess, of what you were speaking about earlier, is where the biological mom just goes along with it.
Yeah. Yeah. In her case, it seemed like she did a lot more than go along with it. She definitely contributed, but yeah.
Very good. Thank you. No, point well taken. She actually engaged in the abuse as well.
Yeah, no, it's awful. I know a lot of people are familiar with that case. That's why I haven't covered that case, because I try to cover the lesser known children.
Yes.
There's an awful lot of them. I always say the statistic is 4 to 7 kids die in the U.S. from abuse or neglect every day. So I couldn't possibly cover them all, but they all deserve to be remembered. And if we can't talk about these topics, then we can't prevent it. So that's what I'm here for.
Well, thank you for covering those stories.
Yeah.
It's certainly much needed.
And giving them voices.
Yeah.
Those that can't speak for themselves deserve voices.
Yeah, that's what I thought when I started this. And yeah, it's not the easiest thing mental health wise for someone who is empathetic, but somebody has to talk about it. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you both coming on. This has been very interesting, and I think that the listeners are going to agree with me on that.
Well, thank you for having us. It's a great opportunity.
Thank you so much to Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott for this fascinating conversation. I really appreciate their expertise as forensic psychologists. Their podcast is excellent, so if you're not already following LA Not So Confidential, you definitely should. I'll include a link in the show notes for this episode. That's it for this episode. Join me next time for another topic. If you like the show, please follow or subscribe to Suffer the Little Children on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast listening app. And please leave me a 5-star rating and a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. Visit the website at sufferthelittlechildrenpod.com. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/STLCpod, where you can become a patron for rewards ranging from a shout-out by name on the show to bonus content and exclusive gifts. You can also support the show at ko-fi.com/STLCpod. Follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Suffer the Little Children Pod and on TikTok at STLCpod. View photos related to today's episode on Facebook. This podcast is researched, written, hosted, edited, and produced by Laine. Intro theme music is by Dream Note Music, and all music for the show is licensed from audiojungle.net. For more information about preventing or reporting child abuse, visit childhelp.org or call your area's child abuse hotline. And remember, if you see something, say something.